Hello beautiful people, I am Chromezone and welcome to my humble abode. Today we are going to do a lesson, history exposition and an adventure, a fun adventure into the world of video game music and video game soundtracks. Who, what, where and when. We're going to have a fun look into video games in the last 50 years. You will figure out where video game soundtracks came from, which games were the most prominent, and you will also find out the many amazing composers and systems that have impacted the video game world. Let me know in the comments below what your favorite soundtrack is. So the whole purpose behind having music and a soundtrack and a score in a video game is to accentuate the feeling and environment that you are in. Let's say we're in Tetris and the game speeds up, and the tempo speeds up, and the BPM the beats per minute will speed up, and the sound and the soundtrack will become more intense overall and have more elements added onto it. It's because it's signifying energy or danger, or it's warning that something big is going to come up. And it also alerts you and makes you more aware of the situation that you are in. So we have a contrast of more chill moments and more dangerous, more exciting and invigorating moments within a video game. But overall, the whole purpose of having music within a video game is to accentuate emotion and the environment within a video game. Before we had sound in video games, it was the 1950s. In the 1950s, we didn't have music or even sound effects inside of a video game. So the first instance that we found music with computers and video games was held in a video game event, and there was a song called God Save the Queen that we probably all know. It's the British national anthem. It was played on a Mark I Ferranti computer in 1951. 1958 to 1970, we didn't have any sound in video games. It was known as the silent era of video game music. So now we head into the 70s and 80s, where music was first embellished into video games. It was known as the chiptune era because of its 8-bit and 16-bit sound. A little known fact, during this time, FM synthesis was first created. It was created by John Chowning in 1967 to 1968. It helped develop sound more within video games, and it also earned 20 million in revenue in licensing from him creating that. How impressive is that? So in the 1970s, it was imminent that arcade games were the most popular thing for kids and teenagers. Video game consoles were later implemented into the household and were a handheld thing. In 1972, the Magnavox Odyssey was first released, which had an instance of music, but the most important game in 1972 was Pong. Pong used little elements of 8-bit sound, so every time it would hit a figure, it would create an 8-bit sound. That was the first implementation of 8-bit sound into video games. Importantly, in 1975, there was a game called Gunfight, which was the first real implementation of music within a video game. In 1977, the Atari was released. In 1978, Space Invaders was first released. It had a change of tempo when things got more difficult, and that was the first implementation of BPM and tempo change. But in the 1980s, we had games like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Vanguard. Vanguard was a game that was released in 1981. It used digital voice, and it also licensed music for the first time. It was the first game also with digital scrolling. The first ever cross-licensing that was ever utilized was a game called Journey. It licensed music from a rock band. In 1983, there was a video game released called Gyrus. It used tracks from Bach, Toccata, and Fugue in D. It helped push music for video games. In 1983, there was a game called Dragon Lair, and Dragon Lair was the first game to use stereo sound. 1985, we had the birth of the NES console. 1985, we had Tetris, and also that year we had Super Smash Bros., which is one of my favorite Nintendo franchises. In 1986, that's when a video game called Zelda, I don't know if you've heard of it, but Zelda was first released. Music was a prominent element within the video game, and it made it just more fun. In 1987, we also had the popular franchise Final Fantasy. In 1989, we had the Michael Jackson game. The Michael Jackson game utilized Michael Jackson's instrumentals. It was the first implementation of remixing real life music and turning it into video game and 8-bit music and putting it into a video game. It's super interesting. In 1989, we had the Game Boy, which is one of my favorite consoles of all time. Well, I prefer the Game Boy Color, but that's because Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue. And Yellow. In 1989, we had the TurboGrafx X. It was a processor for 16-bit music. You could get an adapter for CDs and plug it in. It was about $400. Can you believe the price for a CD player? But you could put your video games in. It was a graphics card that would play your video games. In 1989, we had the Sega Genesis released. The Sega Genesis was very important to music for video games. It offered 6-channel stereo sound. So we went from having mono compatibility to having full-on stereo soundscapes. That's the end of the 1970s to the 1980s. I hope you found that very educational, and we're going to move on to the 1990s. Sorry that the background is getting a bit darker. It's just that, it's getting darker outside. It's about, 5 p.m.? Okay, so the 1990s was the most important 10 years of video game music because it changed what it means to have video game music inside of a video game, an arcade, and everything. It just really transported video game soundtracks and music to that next level. So the most important things that happened in the 1990s were the release of consoles and also more ambitious production for video game music. In 1993, we had the SNES, the SNES. It was the first game console that had a sound chip in it. We had Sony and Panasonic focusing their energies more on using CDs and CD drives inside game consoles. In 1993, we had the Atari. It offered CD value of full soundscapes. In 1994, we had the very famous game Final Fantasy IV come to prominence. And we have 1995. 1995 is not only a great year for video games, but it's also a great year for me because I was born in 1995. Fun fact there. Guess how old I am in the comments. So in 1995, we had the Sega, we had Sony PlayStation 1 release, full-on CD stereo quality sound within our game consoles. In 1996, we had the Nintendo 64. So Nintendo was taking it to a new level. It had increased CPU for music and creative sound effects. So games like Ocarina of Time and Pokemon Colosseum and Smash Bros. And Mario that were a part of the Nintendo 64 all had full-on soundscapes and everything, and it's a really important console. In 1996 also, we had the video game Quake, and we had the band 9 Inch Nails cross-pollinate into each other and create something amazing. So Quake is a first-person shooter game, and 9 Inch Nails made a soundtrack for this video game, and it was the first ever soundtrack that was produced for a video game that had been from a band, like a very famous band. So that's when bands started designing soundtracks for video games. We had the video game Zelda Ocarina of Time released, and that once again had music that was very prominent within the video game to make a more fulfilling experience for the user. We also had Thrasher for the PlayStation 1, and Thrasher had licensed music put in the game, and the licensed music was from the group Public Enemy. We also had Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater as a video game and a brand was a very big part of the soundtrack industry for the 1990s and the 2000s because it licensed a lot of music. The first game that implemented so much licensed music that kind of influenced what Guitar Hero is, or Dance Dance Revolution. That was the beginning of using popular music within a video game. So from the 1990s, we had all this amazing stuff happen. We had consoles, we had music, 9 Inch Nails on a video game. They created their own soundtrack. We had Tony Hawk Pro Skater, Ocarina of Time, the Nintendo 64. Like, so many amazing things got released in the 1990s, but now we are going to move on to the 2000s. So the whole idea of the 2000s was because there was such a good development in technology that we, as well, video game composers decided, okay, we have all the tools now. We have compressors and DAWs and reverbs, or whatever you want to say. Like, we have all the stuff, all the studios and stuff. The 2000s was all about creating the mood and environment. We had games like Halo released on the Xbox. Halo has the greatest soundtrack ever. Try to disagree with me. Try to disagree with me. Halo, honestly, like, all that stuff, it's just incredible. Like, listen to it, man. Like, listen to it. It's so good. We had the Dolby Digital platform put into consoles like the PlayStation 2. What changed from the 2000s, from the 1990s, was it's better sound quality, it's stereo sound quality. We now have televisions, flat screen TVs necessarily in our living rooms, and fantastic audio. We just had so much to have a better video game experience. Games that were musical games like Guitar Hero and Dance Dance Revolution were very important in the 2000s because that really stepped up music for video games for the future. It used complete license of music. I mean, because of that, I mean, FIFA has amazing soundtracks, and so does Need for Speed. Games like Portal, we had the dubstep gun in Saints Row 4. We also had the amazing game Morrowind, and further down the line we have Skyrim by Elder Scrolls and Bethesda. They have just blessed us with amazing soundtracks that are just beautiful. In 2003, we had the video game Tony Hawk Underground. Tony Hawk Underground utilized over 70 licensed tracks. It featured artists such as Kiss, Deltron, 3030, Murs, RA and the Rugged Man, Bracket, NoFX, The Clash, and Sublime. Essentially, this pretty much opened up the idea of having multiple soundtracks within a video game. Instead of a sound and a song looping over and over again, we had a song after a different song after a different song, more as like a soundtrack than a theme or songs just made for the video game, and used popular music to create theme and environment, and it was really cool. Tony Hawk Underground was awesome. Such a sick game too. Like doing pro skater tricks, that's so sick. The major difference from music in the 1950s to 2018 right now is today we have Foley art. We have studios just for video game music, studio sessions where we record orchestras, choirs. We have composers and arrangers and orchestrators just throwing in there and just making amazing works of art inside of a video game soundscape that really just creates atmosphere. We even have had Hans Zimmer work on music for video games. It's incredible. We've also had the development of licensing within video games. We've also gone from having a very simple, one-dimensional form of music to having an amazing mood and emotive music inside the video game that has so much depth. We also have amazing Foley artists. Foley art is not the musical element of a video game, but it's the sounds, the diegetics, the environment, the whistling grass, the sound of air coming at you, the sound of birds, or anything like that. That is all being implemented in video games in the last few years, but it's just such an incredible thing that we can create a whole visual landscape for us inside of technology, basically. We also have virtual reality headsets. That's something in the last 5 years that has really come to prominence, that is really going to change the landscape of music even further inside video games, because instead of thinking two-dimensional in a 180 in stereo landscape as well, in terms of a 360 landscape, think about that for a second, how music will change depending on how close you physically are or how far away you physically are. Also, distance in terms of depth and feet is just incredible how music will change in terms of a 3D landscape. And from the 1950s, we've had incredible music, like chiptune music from Tetris, some of my favorite soundtracks such as Pokemon, all like, we've also had Dragon Ball Z, we've had Digimon, Yu-Gi-Oh! All turned into video games. Super Mario is one of my favorite themes. Metroid Prime. We've had so many amazing songs and soundtracks. We've had Mass Effect soundtrack, Halo soundtrack, Skyrim soundtrack, Witcher 3 soundtrack. That's an incredible one. We've had so much depth and variety in soundtracks and games just made for video games. And that's an incredible thing. So that's music in video games today, and how music in video games have changed from 50 years and onwards. And it's just going to keep changing. We're going to have 3-dimensional audio. Think about that. That blows my mind. I can't do this video without mentioning some of the best composers within the video game world. We've had Hans Zimmer do the Crysis 2 soundtrack, and that's one of the most incredible soundtracks I've ever heard. We've had the composer David Wise do the Donkey Kong series. We've had Tadashi Ikegami, who has worked tremendously hard and composed some amazing material for the Super Smash Bros. Series. We've had another composer for the Super Smash Bros. Series, Hirokazu Ando. We've had Ryuji Sasai, who started the Final Fantasy franchise. We have Koji Kondo, who has composed for the Super Smash Bros. Series and the Legend of Zelda series, and someone that a lot of you guys will thank me for mentioning Michael Giacchino. He composed for the Medal of Honor series and also the very famous Call of Duty series. We've had Kenji Yamamoto, who composed for the Super Metroid series. Tsuyoshi Sekiro, who composed for the famous game Final Fantasy II. Taro Brando, who composed for Super Mario Kart. Let me know who your favorite video game composer is. Alright guys, so let me know if I've missed out on anything or if there's any gaps I need to fill in with this information, because the video game history is just jam-packed full of information that I probably couldn't even cover everything that has ever happened in the last 50 years of video games. But that was a brief overview of the history and different video games and what impacted video games. So I just want to say thank you for watching, and I hope it was very educational. This is Chrome Zone, aka Gary, over and out.